Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm going to be ranking all 26 monitors I tested and reviewed in 2022 in a tier list. You're probably familiar with what a tier list is and might have even seen my previous ranking video I did on Hardware Unboxed at the end of last year, but if you're not, well, here's what it looks like. On the left hand side we have the tiers with the S tier at the top for the best monitors, down to the F tier at the bottom for the worst monitors. Last time this video was pretty long, so I'm expecting something similar today, and I'm not going to speak on each product for very long, so as always, please check out the full reviews for more details on performance and how they stack up. This tier list will feature rankings based on both overall performance and value at times, so products that were too expensive will get ranked down, and products that were great value will see a higher placement, but of course, we'll also be discussing the best overall products as we go. And finally, before we get into it, this video is, well, it's not really meant as a recommendation video, though it will be interesting to see where everything ends up. Like last year, I haven't pre-planned anything, but I would encourage you to watch the full best of monitors videos for more detailed recommendations. The main reason for that is our recommendation videos include monitors from past years that may still be great buys in 2022, whereas this tier list only includes products we tested in 2022. So let's get into it. The first monitor that I reviewed in the year was the Acer Predator XB273UGX. So this was a 1440p, I believe it was 240, maybe 270 Hertz IPS LCD. So obviously designed for gaming there. And at the time, this is one of the better value 1440p products. So if you were getting one a high refresh rate, then this product was going to give you superior value to some of the others. But in terms of its actual performance, you know, it was pretty average. It did have a very wide color gamut, but average calibration. You know, it did support backlight strobing, had locked overdrive controls, which was a bit of a weird one. And yeah, as I said, okay value at the time. I think less so now. It's still available for, I think, around $550 US. 1440p, 240 Hertz has come down in price. So it being, you know, a fairly average product, good, but not amazing. I think I'd probably for now put this into the C tier, but again, we can revisit some of these things later with adjustments and that sort of thing. If it turns out that the C tier, most of those monitors aren't as good as the XB273UGX, then later on we may bump it up a little bit. The next product that we've got to look at is the Samsung Odyssey G7 S28. So this was their 28-inch 4K IPS monitor at 144 Hz. And this was using the same Innolux panel that we'd seen from several other products we tested in 2021. So M28U was kind of the primary example of using the same panel as this. And the M28U last year, I believe, was an S-tier product. It was very good. So the S28, you know, delivers very similar performance, good response times, good colors, average calibration, did have full HDMI 2.1. HDR performance wasn't amazing because it's not an HDR product. And at times throughout the year, especially if you got on sale, I think it offered reasonable value. That said, it wasn't as good value as the M28U in the US or most regions. Of course, it does depend a little bit. But generally, I was quite impressed with the performance. I think these days I'd be putting this into the A tier. It certainly is a very good monitor and offers outstanding performance in a lot of areas. But yeah, I think Samsung, if they had produced, you know, top tier value, class leading value, then I'd be bumping it up to the S tier like the M28U from last year. But I think for now, we'll leave it in the A tier. Next up, we have the Gigabyte M34WQ. So this is an ultra-wide monitor, a bit of an interesting one because it's a flat ultra-wide, still 34 inches, 3440 by 1440, 21:9 aspect ratio IPS. And this is actually quite similar to a lot of Gigabyte products I've been reviewing lately in that it's a very balanced product. So it was no real standout area to performance, but it had good response times, good colors, and did offer better response times than you'd see from a VA monitor, which I think is key for some of these more budget class ultra-wides, where when you're getting that VA panel, you're typically getting things like, you know, dark level smearing, and that doesn't really lead to great motion performance. But with this IPS panel, you do get better motion performance, which I think is one of the key selling points and the reason why you would go with something like this. Again, HDR was pretty unimpressive. I think the pricing of the monitor as well was very fair. It was around that sort of $500 US, sometimes as low as maybe $450 from memory, which makes it reasonably good value. And I would often buy this over a VA ultrawide in this class. I think, yeah, the curve, maybe you'd want the curve and the higher contrast of a VA, but I think most of the time this monitor is the way to go. Again, there's nothing really that's outstanding about this, but I think it's probably better than sort of an average monitor. So I'd probably put this into the B tier. I think that's probably a pretty good spot for the M34WQ. And in contrast to that, we have another ultrawide that I reviewed next in the Sceptre C345B-QUN168. I didn't quite fit the 8 into the little card here for it. This is a terrible monitor. The main issue that I had with this particular display was it was advertised as having display HDR 1000 support. So you'd think, hey, it's an HDR monitor. Surely we're getting good HDR, right? And while it did accurately pass the display HDR tests when we looked into how accurately it was meeting those testing criteria and what the testing criteria actually were, it ended up with, well, issues, let's say, mainly because it doesn't actually have full array local dimming. So I find it hard to recommend an LCD for true HDR unless it has some form of full array local dimming. This monitor, the Sceptre C34B, well, it only has edge-lit local dimming, 2 rows, but yeah, not great. So what we end up with is poor HDR performance despite display HDR 1000 ranking. So with that in mind, it goes into the F tier because of its, well, deceptive and misleading marketing. But on top of that, average response times, locked overdrive settings, there was no sRGB mode, it had flickering and scanline issues as well. So definitely can't recommend this monitor, and I'd put it into the F tier as a result. I think it's a well-deserved F tier for that particular product. Next up is the LG 27G P950s. This is quite similar to the previous 27GN 950 that I looked at. Maybe that was 2021 or maybe the year before that, can't quite remember. But this is your 4K 160Hz IPS panel, 27 inches, and it does have decent panel quality. One of the advantages of the LG Nano IPS panel that's used for this LG as opposed to, say, the the Innolux panel that we see for the S28, it does have a slightly wider color gamut than you get from the Innolux panels, which makes it a bit better suited to productivity work, but that can depending on your exact use cases, of course. With the 27G P950 specifically, we do get good response times, good tuning there, slightly above average factory calibration, poor HDR, not really an HDR monitor, and yeah, decent quality panel, HDMI 2.1, as I said. The main issue with this monitor, and why I probably wouldn't put it immediately into the A tier, is that it was very expensive, and it continues to be very expensive to this day. I think if you're buying something like the S28 for around $550 US, and this monitor's coming in at more like $750 US, it makes it very expensive and kind of hard to recommend when it is very similar to the S28. So if we're measuring just based on the performance of the monitor, I'd have the 27G P950 in the A tier, but I think because of its high price, I would have to bump it down to the B tier here. So let's just lock that in place there. Next up, we have the Pixio PX277 Pro. So this is the only Pixio monitor that we tested this year, 27-inch 1440p 165Hz IPS, and this is a good basic monitor. So it has okay response time, it's a bit below average for factory calibration, its sRGB mode didn't work very well, but it's sort of keeping up with the pack in terms of what today's more budget and entry-level class 1440p monitors are offering. So if we're talking purely based on performance, I think this would probably be a C-tier product. The issue with the PX277 Pro was mostly around it sort of offering that basic entry-level, low-cost experience, but being priced more in sort of the mid-range for 1440p monitors today. I believe even as we speak right now, it's priced around $350 US, whereas the baseline for 1440p in 2022 has been more like $250 US, and there's some monitors coming up that do meet that sort of price range. So when you're sort of getting C-tier level performance, but at too high of a price, I think it has to be moved down to the D tier, which maybe is a little harsh. Maybe we'll adjust that later. Maybe it should be in the C tier, but I think just, based on it being an average panel with too high of a price, I think it probably should be in the D tier. The MSI Optix MAG281URF is a very simple monitor to rank in this tier list, and I'm going to be putting it into the A tier. And the reason for that is that it's very similar to the Samsung G7 S28. Like the M28U that we reviewed last year, it uses the same Interlux panel, so most of the main performance characteristics, things like performance for motion and also color quality, is very similar between these two products. So it doesn't make a lot of difference which particular monitor you get, you're going to end up with a very similar experience. On top of that, MSI is also pricing it very similarly to the G7. So again, there's not a lot separating those two products. I think if you were buying a 4K 144Hz 28-inch monitor using IPS technology, of course, then you could easily split the difference between those and just buy whichever one is cheaper in your region, or the M28U that we've talked about extensively in some of our recommendation videos. Again, this monitor, average sort of factory calibration, good levels of performance, and yeah, sort of that pricing isn't quite at the level of the M28U. So again, if it was priced as well as the M28U, instant S tier in my opinion, but I think at the current pricing, it's still a good product. It's still definitely worth recommending in the A tier. It's just not the sort of S tier standout that we saw earlier. Next up, we have the Cooler Master GM27FQS. This is a monitor that I put through my full testing suite, but I never actually produced a video on. You might have seen some of these results in benchmark charts in other videos, sort of comparing to the performance of other products. The main reason why I didn't review this is that it wasn't that interesting of a monitor. It just has average performance across all areas. Nothing was really a standout there. And at the time, and I believe still today, it didn't really offer great value. So when you're looking at this being a 27-inch 1440p 165Hz IPS panel, it sort of falls into the same issues as the PX277 Pro, in that it's offering that mid to entry-level type performance today, but is sort of trying to price up into that $300 to $400 US range. And these days in that price range, you can get 1440p 240Hz at $400, or some of the really good quality 1440p, 160, 180Hz monitors we've seen previously, things like, LG 27 GP850. So when you're pricing against that sort of monitor, you have to produce the same sort of performance. And ultimately, I don't think it really delivered that. But again, didn't have any notable deal breaker issues either that would sort of push it into E or F tier. Nothing was super broken about it. It just is average with a not great price point. So I think we put the PX277 Pro in there. The GM27FQS also belongs in there. Next up, I think we're going to have one of the more difficult rankings in this particular video, that being the Alienware AW3423DW. The reason I say that is that undoubtedly this is a very good product. So we're going to be talking about top tier sort of levels here with this particular monitor. And just as a recap, of course, 34-inch 3440 by 1440 ultra-wide monitor with OLED technology, 175Hz. And this is really the first gaming appropriate monitor that used OLED technology. So of course we're getting all the elite OLED experiences that you'd expect, like its excellent HDR performance, its elite response times, had great colors. Those are the main three advantages here. And as well, on top of that, we got 175Hz refresh rate. Previously, when we were looking at the OLED TVs like the LG C1, 120Hz refresh rate, this was bumping it up to a much more appropriate refresh rate, and all the benefits of sort of PC use. So DisplayPort, we had no automatic brightness limiter in SDR mode, and really lots of benefits. It is truly a great display. Based on everything I've just been saying, you'd think probably this would be an S tier monitor, but what I'm thinking is that there's also a few issues with the Alienware monitor, sort of those early adopter type things. So for example, the QD OLED panel screen coating isn't ideal, reflected a lot of ambient light, it had audible fan noise, a lack of user upgradable firmware, had a weird subpixel layout, so the triangle RGB layout, which means that it wasn't as suited to desktop productivity use, along with obviously the OLED burn-in risk and those sorts of things. So I feel like if you were early adopting this particular QD OLED monitor, as I did, then some of those issues would probably negate it back down to the A tier, which is, harsh, I guess. It probably also deserves to be maybe between the S and the A tier. But I think, if some of those issues weren't present, like for example, if it didn't have as much fan noise or it had better screen coating, then I think I could pretty comfortably put it into the S tier. We do have the DWF model coming up later in this video as well, so we'll see where that gets ranked. But I think for now, just based on it having some of those issues, and it not being the perfect product, even though there'd be products that are not perfect that I would rank in the S tier, I think there's just a few too many issues to put it into the S tier for now. But again, I think it's a very difficult product to rank in this sort of tier list because we've got it here. We've got up against the G7 and the MAG281URF, and it is a better monitor than both of those monitors. But these products have fewer issues than the Alienware. These monitors are sort of better value and cheaper. This is $1,300 US. So again, there's a lot of discussion points there about that particular monitor, and maybe we'll end up re-ranking it later. But for now, let's keep it in the A tier. Next up, we have the Gigabyte M27Q X, and for me, this is immediately an S tier monitor. And the reason I say that is that it's a 1440p 240Hz IPS monitor at 27 inches, but it has been consistently priced throughout at least the second half of 2022 at just $400 US. So that's a great value buy. Previously in that sort of price tier, we were only getting 1440p, sort of that mid to mid-high refresh rate, so 144 up to around that 180 Hz with products like the LG 27G P850. With the M27Q X, we bumped that up to 240 Hz, and again, Gigabyte's providing a really balanced experience. So it had great performance in terms of color quality, good calibration there. It had decent response times. It didn't have a single overdrive mode experience, but I think for the price, that's probably acceptable. Flat IPS. And yeah, just when you're getting that sort of balanced experience with no major notable flaws, and it comes in at a really good, affordable price point, it's shifting the monitor market forward, and it's making that 1440p resolution cheaper and more accessible to more buyers, especially with the GPUs that we've got today that can run 1440p at super high frame rates. Something like the M27Q X is a great pairing for those sorts of products. So I think this is clearly an S tier monitor, in my opinion, and one of the best products that was released in 2022. I do highly recommend it. And yeah, a lot of that comes down to the value of the monitor. Again, if we're sort of talking about just the performance, it's probably A tier, but I think the value proposition elevates it up that little bit to the S tier. The X27Q is another interesting product in terms of its ranking, mainly because the real strength of the HP X27Q was value. It's a 27-inch 1440p 165Hz IPS monitor, and it was very cheap. Like, you can get it for $200 to $250 US at times, which is really good value for a 1440p display, and that's taking over the entry-level price points, which is great to see. But in terms of its performance, it's a fairly average monitor, has okay response times, average calibration, no sRGB mode, fairly limited wide gamut support, poor contrast. It does have some good features, height adjustable stand, for example, and the performance isn't terrible or anything. It's certainly not like D or E tier performance, but it is a fairly average product in terms of its performance overall. So based on performance, I'd put it into the C tier, but I think with its excellent value for a lot of buyers, I think that's going to elevate it into the B tier, because again, the reason why you'd buy something like this monitor is because of its value. You want 1440p at the cheapest price point, and it doesn't have any major deal-breaking flaws like major flickering issues or things like that. So yeah, I think the B tier is pretty appropriate for the X27Q. Next up, we have the annoyingly named MSI MPG Artymis 273CQRX-QD, a long name from MSI there. They love their long names. This is another monitor that is very much a fail, so we'll be talking about either E or F tier with this product. It's a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz VA monitor, and the main issue that I had with this is that it presents the same specifications as you would see from the Samsung Odyssey G7. So it's the same 1000R curved monitor, same 240Hz refresh rate, same VA technology. In fact, I believe it uses basically the same panel. The main issue with this, though, is that it didn't give you Odyssey G7 performance. So you weren't getting the response times of the G7. The G7 is a very fast monitor, delivering great performance. This monitor had issues like dark level smearing and just lackluster response times, which at the same sort of price tier, it was quite an expensive monitor, sort of priced in that same range as the Odyssey G7. It makes it basically impossible to recommend because it didn't offer the performance of that product. And I think it was almost misleading to advertise it as having a similar feature set when it wasn't really delivering the same experience or performance. So if they were able to offer G7 performance, then this would be, A or B tier like the G7. But unfortunately, I think it probably has to go into the F tier because, I was really disappointed with the performance that it offered at the price tag that it was offering. Unfortunately for MSI, that product is an F tier product. The next 12 monitors to rank have appeared on screen now, so let's get going. with the Gigabyte M27Q P. So this was their successor to the very popular M27Q, replacing the panel with one that doesn't use a BGR subpixel layout. Still a 27-inch 1440p 170Hz IPS, but it provided a wider color gamut, better calibration. It was slightly faster as well, and very competitive against monitors that had a similar specs and price tag. This is quite an affordable monitor. At the time that I reviewed it, the pricing wasn't great, which probably would have limited it to maybe B tier in terms of its value. But when we got sort of towards the end of 2022, in the last couple of months, Gigabyte has dropped the price to be one of the most affordable entry-level monitors. And compared to something like the HP X27Q that we talked about earlier, it is a much better monitor in terms of its performance. So when you're looking at, the M27Q P is slightly more expensive than the X27Q in a lot of regions, but I think because of its performance, it has to go into the A tier. It is a very good product, and that is where I'd be ranking it. So yeah, very impressive product from Gigabyte, and I really like their M series in general. We've got the M27Q X in the S tier, we've got the M27Q P in the A tier, the M34WQ in the B tier. I think it's once again showing that Gigabyte have quite a good range of monitors, especially in terms of price to performance and value. M27Q P being no exception there. Next up, we've got the Sony Inzone M9, one of the first Sony monitors that I've tested on the channel. I believe they're releasing some more monitors next year, so we'll see how those go. But for now, let's talk about the M9. So this was a 27-inch 4K 144Hz IPS monitor with quite a unique backlighting setup with 96 zones of full array local dimming. So that did allow it to provide sort of a basic HDR experience, which is superior to some of, for example, G7 S28 and MAG281URF. Those monitors didn't really include HDR at all, whereas this monitor, it does have some HDR, gives you that basic experience. Outside of that, did have fairly average response times, average calibration, no sRGB mode, and panel performance that was pretty similar to the 27GP950. One of the issues with this monitor, well, firstly, is that obviously we're not getting top tier HDR. So with only 96 zones, we're still limited to that sort of basic entry-level HDR experience, in my opinion. And it was quite expensive as well, costing, I believe it was $800 or $900 US, which is a very expensive for a 4K monitor, especially in the second half of this year, where you'll see on the side here, we've got things like Neo G7, LG C2 to cover, as well as GP27U. All those monitors did beat it for value in terms of HDR, generally speaking. So Inzone M9, I think we had that sort of window where it was a good buy for a couple of months, but then did get superseded by products towards the end of the year. So based on that, and also it did have a few firmware bugs that I believe maybe they haven't solved up to this point in time, which is a bit disappointing. Back when it launched, I would have put this into the A tier. I think at the moment, do I put it into the B or into the C tier? It performs pretty similarly to the 27GP950. It's not as well optimized, but it does have the advantage of HDR, but then again, it's also more expensive than the 27GP950. So maybe it deserves to be in the C tier, but the C tier feels kind of harsh for this monitor. So I'm really torn on this one. I think I'll put it into the B tier because I still like what it offers, but it does need to be cheaper. It does need to be more around $700 US, maybe even $600 US. That's where it would find its real niche in the market. So I don't know, I'm going to leave in the B tier for now, but that's one that definitely may be adjusted once we see the positioning of other products. Next up, we have got the MSI Optix MAG274QRX. This is very similar to the M27Q X in terms of its performance. It is slightly better than it, in my opinion, because it has a single overdrive mode experience, or at least better tuned overdrive performance compared to the M27Q X, and it does have a few more built-in color modes, which is better if you're using it for productivity performance. However, it is mostly a gaming focused product, 27-inch 1440p 240Hz IPS. So I think the main benefit there would be the single overdrive mode experience. So, you'd probably think surely that belongs in the S tier as well. The main reason why I probably wouldn't put it into the S tier is that it's only slightly better than the M27Q X, but it costs a lot more. So generally speaking, you're looking at least 20% more to buy the MSI model. which means for most people I'd recommend getting the M27Q X because ultimately it's a very similar monitor and the value equation is strongly in favor of the Gigabyte. But it is still a very good product. So I think for now it would belong into the what have we got here? The A tier. I think along with these other monitors, it is a good buy, a good monitor, but not quite as good value as the M27Q X. So for me, I'd be putting that into the A tier for now. Next up, the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7. So this is a 32-inch 4K 165Hz VA monitor with 1196 zone full array local dimmings. This is one of the first 4K monitors that are available for PC use that does genuinely provide good quality HDR. A lot of the other monitors that we've been looking at previously with HDR have either been super expensive, like the PG32UQ X, or really large, like the LG C1. The Neo G7 sort of introduced this 32-inch size, 4K panel, great HDR experience, good levels of brightness, and the same sort of great motion performance that we've seen from Samsung's previous VA panels in terms of its tuning. So still had mediocre calibration and the 1000R curve, which I'm not a huge fan of the curve, but generally speaking, what you're getting from a motion performance standpoint and from an HDR standpoint at 4K 165Hz was very impressive and is probably one of the more highly recommended HDR monitors that I would have across 2022. The main problem with this monitor, apart from the things I've already mentioned, is probably that its MSRP of $1,300 is quite expensive. However, Samsung have frequently discounted that down to the $1,000 range or even as low as $800. At $800, it's an outstanding buy. If this was an $800 monitor, I'd put it into the S tier. Because it's more frequently been seen around $1,000, I think it probably deserves to be in the A tier because, again, there are a few issues with it. But generally speaking, I think the HDR experience that you're getting from the Neo G7 is excellent and I do recommend it. So that will go into the A tier. And just at the moment, I think it's been a pretty good year for monitors looking at it so far with the amount of products that we've put into either the S, A or B tiers and not too many in the sort of lower rungs at the moment, which I think is good. However, that said, we're just about to rank the Odyssey Neo G8, which for me, I think this is a pretty clear E tier product. And the reason I say that is that it's very similar to the Neo G7, but it increases the refresh rate to 240 Hz. The cost of that though is of course a high price tag, but on top of that, it also introduced scanline issues at the highest refresh rate. So you're sort of upgrading the refresh rate from the G7 to the G8, but then the highest refresh rate isn't really worth using because it has these artifact issues. So that kind of negates the whole purpose of spending more money to buy the 240 Hz option. So that's why throughout most of the year I've been recommending the G7 over the G8. I think the G7 is the better product than the G8. So the G8 not really being worth buying, I think puts it into the E tier. It's not as flawed or terrible as the two F tier products that we've got here. So I think it does make a lot more sense to keep it in the E tier, but I certainly wouldn't be ranking it above that sort of, level. If this did not have scanline issues, then we'd be looking at S or A tier. It'd be very similar to the Neo G7 in terms of its ranking, because obviously it would just be a Neo G7 with a higher refresh rate, which would of course be worth buying. But with that flaw, and also with the testing, generally speaking, being worse than the G7, so my Neo G7 outperformed my Neo G8 in a lot of areas. Again, it makes it very hard to rank that above the E tier, and it's certainly not a product that I'd recommend for most people, so I think E tier is pretty fair. Next up, we've got the LG C2 OLED. So this is an excellent OLED monitor, and with this generation, the C2 generation, it has been brought down to a 42-inch size. So this is a 42-inch 4K 120Hz OLED, and I think at that size, it is a much more manageable product than what we saw last year with the C1, which only bottomed out at 48 inches. 48 inches is pretty unmanageable on most desktop setups. You kind of have to sit a little bit further away than usual. At 42 inches with the C2, it's a very immersive display, and I think it works with some desk setups. It's not going to be suitable for everyone because it is quite a large monitor still. But yeah, I think the sizing of this monitor is much more appropriate. The main issue here is probably that obviously some of its OLED burn-in issues is one consideration, and also that it only tops out at 120 Hz, which is a fairly low refresh rate by modern standards, and it lacks a lot of the desktop features that we've been used to, things like DisplayPort, no automatic brightness limiters. Those are all concerns with the C2, mainly because it is designed as a TV, which kind of makes sense. The positive there, though, is that you get a full set of TV features, including excellent ability to hardware calibrate the display. It supports Dolby Vision, has lots of HDMI 2.1 support, and of course, it has all the benefits of OLED, like elite per pixel dimming, elite response time speed, and these days it's available at a really outstanding price of like $800 US, which that's just a ludicrously low price. That's a very, very affordable price. So I think for me, it's at least an A tier product. The question here though is that I'm ranking it, the same as the AW3423DW, which throughout most of the year I think has been very fair. I personally slightly prefer the Alienware monitor for my everyday gaming needs. I just prefer the ultra-wide format and some of the PC features, including its high refresh rate. But the C2 is much cheaper. At $800, it's $1,300 to get the Alienware. The C2 has dropped in price significantly since it was launched. The Alienware is pretty much the same price. So, do I put this into the S tier based on pricing? It's a difficult decision because generally I would recommend the Alienware over the C2. So does that mean I then need to move the Alienware into the S tier because the C2's in the S tier? Or do I move the C2 back down to the A tier because it still has some of the OLED issues that I talked about that sort of also apply to the AW3423DW? It doesn't really have as much of a screen coating issue, still has a subpixel issue, still has the burn-in risk, still has, some of the lack of desktop suitable features. So at $800, I think I have to put into the S tier. I think I have to put it there just based on the fact that it's that price, because we're talking cheaper than the Inzone M9, and it's much better than the Inzone M9 in terms of its HDR performance. Of course, you have to put up with the 42-inch size, but I think it has to go in the S tier at that price. If it was still $1,000 A tier at its current price, yeah, I think it really has to be there in the S tier. All right, after that extremely difficult discussion with the LG C2, let's move into the AOC 24G2 SPs. This is an update to the 24G2 that I believe I probably ranked that in the S tier last year. I can't quite remember, it was either S or A tier, very highly ranked product. 24-inch 1080p 165Hz IPS. So, it is still an entry-level product, being a 1080p monitor, one of the only 1080p monitors I looked at this year. And by modern standards, in terms of things like response times and that sort of thing, it is only an average monitor, so it doesn't quite give you the same speed that you'd be getting from, say, M27Q P at 1440p, which is now the sort of low-cost, great value 1440p monitor. It does have great calibration, it is a wide gamut monitor, does have a very good price, but whether or not, it wasn't a significant update on the 24G2, which is now a 2-year-old product. So, and it is only 1080p, and 1440p is encroaching a little bit on the pricing of 1080p, making it not as outstanding value of a product. So I think for now I'd probably put this into the B tier, but again, I could make a case for it being an A tier monitor as well. It's one or the other, B or A tier. But I think just being 1080p and the value of 1440p these days, probably a B tier product for now. Next up, we've got the Asus ROG Swift PG42UQ. So this is Asus's take on the LG C2 that I've put into the S tier. The main differences between the C2 and the PG42UQ was that the PG42UQ increases the refresh rate to 138Hz and also introduces many desktop suitable features. So it adds in DisplayPort, and it also has a uniform brightness mode, which means you can disable the automatic brightness limiter that is a bit annoying with desktop usage on the LG C2. It also uses a matte coating, which cuts down on reflections compared to the C2, but that does come at the cost of diffuse light and reflection, so it's not going to appear as dark and black as the C2 in some scenarios. That's a personal preference thing in my opinion as to whether you'd prefer the coating of the C2 or the PG42UQ. It also lacks some of the TV features that we see from the C2. So it doesn't have Dolby Vision support. It doesn't have as extensive hardware calibration features there. It does get brighter though than the C2 in my testing despite using the same panel. I think the Asus model is better cooled, and of course higher refresh rate means it has better motion clarity as well, though of course response times are fairly similar. So this is again a fairly difficult monitor to rank. I've got the C2 in the S tier. I don't think the PG42UQ is as good as the C2 in general, just because of some of the C2's additional processing features. Dolby Vision is a big feature if you want an HDR monitor, better calibration support, and I do personally prefer the glossy coating. The other issue with the PG42UQ is that it is very expensive relative to the C2. So if you did want some of those specific desktop features, things like its automatic brightness limiter disabling feature, DisplayPort, high refresh rate, you're going to have to pay quite a bit of money compared to the C2. I think it could be up to around 40 or 50% more expensive, which simply isn't worth it. So based on that, I think I'm going to drop this down just slightly to the B tier. If they were able to get this monitor out at around, $1,100 US, if it was sort of that more aggressive, more affordable price point, certainly undercutting something like the AW3423DW, which I also think this monitor is better than the PG402UQ, then I think it could probably go into the A tier, but it's definitely at the very least a B tier product. It is very good, just isn't quite as good as the excellent C2. Next up, we have the LG 32GQ950. This was an interesting monitor and that's a 32-inch 4K 160Hz IPS display, but it did deliver better performance than a lot of the 32-inch 4K monitors that I tested in this sort of SDR-only price category. Of course, now we've got the Neo G7. Where did I end up putting that? Up here, Neo G7 4K HDR at 32 inches. This is sort of your flat IPS with very mediocre HDR performance. So it doesn't really support HDR, maybe semi-HDR at best, but the benefits that it has is that it is very fast for this sort of size of IPS LCD. The previous generation that we'd seen last year, a lot of those monitors were pretty slow in terms of gaming performance. They didn't match the level of speed that we'd seen from IPS monitors in sort of 27-inch classes or other types of panel. This monitor doesn't have that issue, which makes it a lot more suitable for gaming. And then on top of that, it has a very wide color gamut. It has minimized IPS glow thanks to the new technology being used here. And it did also have above average calibration, which makes it quite a good option. The issue that I had with this product is that it is very expensive. LG were pricing this pretty much to compete with some of the HDR options like the Neo G7. I think the MSRP of the Neo G7 and the 32GQ950 are the same at like $1,300 US, which is just crazy. You buy the Neo G7 every time over this at the same price. But if you did need a 32-inch 4K IPS monitor and you had that sort of balanced workload between gaming and content creation, then this is a genuinely quite a good choice. I would only recommend it though at a discounted price, and it has been discounted at times. Again, this is a difficult product to rank. I don't think it belongs in the A tier. Does it belong in the B tier based on its performance? I think it probably does. If it was only ever available at $1,300 US, I'd have to drop it to the C tier, but because at times it's been discounted, I think it belongs in the B tier. So again, it's just a difficult product to rank compared to some of these other monitors. But then again, we've got the 27GP950 there, the Inzone M9, it's pretty similar. Yeah, I think that's probably fair comparing it to those sort of products. So yeah, let's keep it in the B tier. Okay, another monitor that I think is going to be very difficult to rank, the Cooler Master Tempest GP27U. So yeah, this monitor is kind of one of the most affordable 4K true HDR products that we've seen so far. So this being a 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS with 576 zone full array local dimming backlight capability. So definitely a true HDR product. Of course, not quite as good HDR performance as we see from some of the OLEDs in here or the Neo G7 with its higher zone count backlight and VA panel, but still very good HDR performance, generally speaking. It also had solid motion performance, had a very wide color gamut, decent sRGB mode, and a good price. It was, at least at launch, around $800 US. It is more difficult to find these days, so whether that price will change, who knows. The main issue that we had with this monitor when it launched was that the firmware did not allow you to use HDR and adaptive sync at the same time. And since we've now tested the firmware update, the monitor does have some flickering concerns. So this kind of, there's a lot of things to consider here. So based on its HDR performance, we're probably looking at a C tier product, maybe B tier. It's better than the Inzone M9 in terms of its HDR performance at a better price. When we sort of factor in the very wide color gamut and its motion performance, I think B tier in terms of its overall performance package would be warranted. So that's where I would have it based on that. I think if we're then factoring in value, you'd have to bump it up to the A tier because it's better than the Inzone M9 at a lower price. So, when we think about that sort of, support, I think the GP27U would have to be elevated to the A tier. That said, we then have the firmware issues, it being launched in sort of a bad state, it also having those flickering concerns which may or may not appear while gaming. It's It's very difficult to say. I was able to reproduce it in sort of more test environments, but whether you see that in gaming is a much more difficult proposition to answer. So, maybe that makes it a C tier or even D tier product. I don't know. Like, I think I'll put it in the C tier because, I'm really on the fence about recommending it. It's one of those really difficult products that, if I said go out and buy it and then someone buys it and sees flickering issues, then I'd feel bad for that customer that I've recommended that product and they've had issues with it. But then again, if you don't see the flickering issues, then it is a good HDR monitor with good performance and a good price. So maybe C tier. Cooler Master's been working on firmware updates quite a bit. I don't think they'll be able to solve the flickering problems though, because I think that's more of a hardware thing. Again, it's a very difficult monitor to rank. It's very, very difficult. I'll leave it in the C tier for now. We may re-rank it later. Next up, we've got the Asus ROG Swift PG27AQN. This is the ultimate 1440p monitor, in my opinion. It doesn't quite have all the features that you want, doesn't have great HDR performance, but if you're looking for a competitive focused monitor for multiplayer gaming, the PG27AQN is where it's at. 27-inch 1440p 360Hz IPS monitor. It has excellent response time performance, very fast, and obviously you get great motion clarity because it is a 360Hz display. And when you get that at 1440p, you're sort of getting the best of both worlds. You've got this really nice resolution that is relevant for competitive gaming today. It looks better to play games at 1440p, and today's GPU hardware can certainly run a lot of esports games at that sort of frame rate. And on top of that, you can use this for single player games because it's a 1440p monitor, so you're not seeing all the individual pixels like you might see at 1080p. And again, it just has great performance, great factory calibration. The only downside, as I said, was that you're not getting HDR, which might be a consideration at that sort of high price point. And then of course the price point as well is very expensive. So this is a very expensive monitor. But I think if you want the best of the best, and considering there's very few flaws and downsides to this monitor, I think I have to rate this in the S tier. It's a great monitor, and I think people that bought it would be very, very happy with it. And for esports competitive gaming at 360Hz with the feature set that it's got, I don't think that there's anything that's really better than it in the 1440p class at the moment. The GP27Q is up next. So this is another Cooler Master monitor, similar to the GP27U. However, this is the 1440p variant. So it's a 27-inch 1440p 165Hz IPS monitor, and it still has the 576 zone full array local dimming backlight, and basically performs very similarly to the GP27U across all areas of performance. So based on that and what we've talked about previously, including its firmware flickering issues, maximum I could award this monitor is the C tier. However, the current state of the firmware is much worse than the GP27U. It has other issues that were introduced as they tried to fix some of the HDR plus VRR issues. So for example, color banding at the highest refresh rate. We saw issues with a brightness bug in the monitor. And yeah, there's still a few other broken things that they need to fix in that monitor, like the local dimming in the SDR mode, things like that. So based on that, I was very unimpressed with that firmware update, and I think it being sold to consumers right now and being a product that you can buy and fork out, like it's like $500 US, makes it hard to recommend when they launch a firmware update that actually makes the monitor worse. And I don't like companies beta testing monitors on consumers. They should be fixing these problems before it ships. So I think this goes into the E tier, similar to the Neo G8, where we've there's two monitors in a similar family. One works a bit better than the other. So the one that works the worst probably gets downvoted into the E tier. But yeah, it's not a monitor I can recommend. So something like the E tier I think would be suitable for this product. But again, I don't think, like these monitors, the two F tier monitors just aren't worth buying at all. If Cooler Master does end up fixing the GP27Q via a firmware update, then it would be worth buying because it is a good value monitor, and the hardware is good. There is some good quality hardware there. So I don't think F tier is quite warranted, but E tier feels about right to me. Final two monitors, and next up we have the HP HyperX Armada 27. This is a pretty typical 1440p 165Hz IPS monitor in a 27-inch size, of course. It does lean a little bit to the high end in terms of its performance, things like motion performance, color quality, calibration. It has no sRGB mode limitations as well, which is nice. Those are sort of high-end features, or at least high-end sort of performance for this class of product. You know, we're just exclusively talking 1440p 165Hz here. And it also comes with a monitor arm mount, which for some people is going to be a good feature addition because it is, you know, it's a handy feature to have. You get very adjustable stand. It's a good quality arm mount that's included. The main issue with the Armada 27 is that it's very expensive. It's like $500 US, which it just isn't worth it, to be honest. At $500 US, I think I have to put it down into sort of the D tier. And my reasoning behind that is, while the performance is good, it comes with the arm mount. If you're spending $400 US, you could just buy the M27Q X and add in an arm mount for about $80 to $100 US, or even cheaper than that. And now you're at the price point of the Armada 27, but you have a 1440p 240Hz display, which is going to give you a much better gaming experience. So I just don't think I can recommend the Armada 27 at its price point. It just doesn't really cut the mustard, in my opinion, at that price. I think if they're sort of trying to differentiate based on the arm mount, it has to be at least $400. That's kind of the maximum that I could recommend, if not a little bit lower. Because again, we've got monitors like M27Q P, X27Q X offering 1440p 165Hz for under $300. So to go like $500 US, yeah, it's very similar to these other sort of, you know, not great value 1440p offerings that we see there. And the final monitor in these rankings is the Alienware AW3423DWF. So this being the F model, it's very similar to the DW model, except 165Hz versus 175Hz. It removes the G-Sync module in favor of just a traditional scaler, and it's a little bit cheaper at $1,100 US versus $1,300 US, which, you know, that's decent price saving. You're saving $200, that's pretty good. It does have a few other differences that we noted in testing, the big one being that its HDR modes are not as accurate as what you'd see on the DW model. However, it has user upgradable firmware, it has more features, it has lower fan noise, and all of those things sort of, you know, they help out with some of the issues that we saw with the DW. But ultimately, it still has some of the same problems as the DW, such as its screen coding, subpixel layout, risk of burn-in. All those considerations are still going to be issues with the DWF model. In my review, I think I said it was very difficult to separate the DW and the DWF in terms of its overall performance. You could go either way there. You could save a little bit of money and get the DWF and a few additional benefits, or you could still choose to buy the DW and you do get the superior HDR performance and also slightly higher refresh rate. So either way you go with those monitors, I think they're going to be great for you. And yeah, they're great buys. They're great monitors. So yeah, they definitely both deserve to be in the A tier and on the same footing. If a firmware update was able to resolve the HDR accuracy problems with the DWF in its HDR 1000 mode, giving buyers a much better experience in that mode, equivalent to what you see in the DW, then I would elevate this to the S tier. And the reason for that is that it's a cheaper monitor that would then basically perform the same as the DW. So if it's cheaper, performs better, and it has additional features, that would put that into the S tier for me. But right now, I think I would put it in the A tier. So yeah, that's where things lie. I guess the question now is whether any of these monitors deserve re-rankings, because we've got the final rankings here, and it's been interesting to see that this year I've sort of, I guess, gravitated towards testing products that are good and worth recommending. We've got the majority of the monitors in the B tier and above, which I think is a good sign for at least the products that I was looking at this year. That said, there were a few monitors that I didn't get around to testing that were sort of on the weaker end of the scale, just didn't have the time this year, you know, working on this new studio and stuff like that. And if I had tested those products, we probably would have seen a few more in the C, D, and E tiers. Maybe I'll get to testing those early next year, so we'll see. Maybe that, you know, impacts the rankings next year. But let's go through and have a look at some of the more contentious choices that I was having difficulty with earlier in the video. I think one of the main ones would be sort of C2 versus AW3423DW versus the DWF model. And I think, again, based on performance, I think they should all be in the same tier. and in the same tier as the Neo G7. I think that's all pretty fair going, even though I would generally recommend the DW over the other monitors. Again, it's very complicated. But I think the C2 at its price point being so aggressive, does that deserve to be dropped down to the A tier because I rank it the same? Again, it's a very difficult discussion. I wish there was something between the S and the A tier that I could rank the C2, the DW, and the DWF in, because I think that's probably where it would go. But then I don't want to move all of these products down a tier. I don't think something like the X27Q or the 24G2SP or PG42UQ deserves to be a C tier monitor, because they're all pretty good. So I think on that I would leave all of those monitors in the same position, I think. But that's only based on the value of the C2. Otherwise, it would be in the A tier. So yeah, just keep that in mind. The one monitor I do think needs to be down-ranked, just looking at this chart, is probably the Inzone M9. I think that probably needs to go into the C tier, just because after evaluating things like the GP27U in terms of its HDR performance, again, has flickering issues, so you kind of got to mitigate that a little bit. But when we're sort of looking at the price tag of $900, it's more expensive than the C2. It's similar price to the G7 on a discount. It's getting up there to the 3423 DWF, and those are all much better products in terms of HDR performance. So I think the Inzone M9 needs to drop down to the C tier. And then on top of that, I think the 27GP 950 needs to move down as well, because both of those are not awesome value. And I'd probably buy the Inzone M9 over the 27GP 950 at the same price. And with the current pricing discrepancy, I think they're probably similarly priced in terms of value. And of course, performance is quite similar between these two products. So I think on a re-ranking, I'd probably have to move these two down, because honestly, I'd probably buy something like the PG4GQ is a better monitor. These products that we've got here, M34WQ, X27Q, 24G2SP, those are all great value monitors without delivering top tier performance. These are sort of good performing monitors with poor value. So I think both of those probably deserve to be dropped down to the C tier. So I think that's a more suitable ranking there. For example, like I would definitely have the 24G2SP being a better monitor in terms of overall offering for budget buyers than I would the Inzone M9 as an overall offering for high-end buyers. I think there's more reason to buy a 24G2SP or an X27Q if you are a budget shopper than there is if you're a high-end shopper looking at something like the Inzone M9. This then throws into question the 32GQ 950. Again, performance is very similar to the 27GP 950, but I think the reason why I would still keep this in the B tier is that there's fewer good 32-inch options that offer what the GQ 950 does, whereas the 27GP 950 has very strong competition from G7 S28, MAG281URF, M28U, those products. So based on that, I think 32GQ 950 still deserves to be in the B tier. I think M34WQ also still deserves to be here. I think this is a much more comfortable array. The GP27U, again, that was a very difficult product to rank as well, based on its flickering issues and the fact that I probably wouldn't recommend it for people. But then the Inzone M9, I probably would recommend it over that, maybe. That's a hard one. That's a very hard discussion. I have to go back and look more in depth at the reviews I did of those, to be honest, to properly rank that. So yeah, I think I'll probably keep the GP27U in that position. I think these three are all great examples of D-tier monitors. They're not terrible in any specific way. They're not outstanding in any specific way, but also they're not great value, so they're not really worth buying. So I think D-tier. And then the E and the F tier, I like that that's kind of reserved for the monitors that do have fundamental hardware issues. We've got the scanline issues, we've got the firmware problems, we've got the fake HDR and terrible VA performance, and the high price and terrible VA performance of that monitor. So I think all those make sense, and I think I'm pretty satisfied with M27Q X, M27Q P. Yeah, those all feel right to me. I feel like, yeah, if you're buying sort of a more budget, it's not budget really, but a lower cost 4K option, you got some great options these days with those. Yeah, I think that's the final tier list that I'll go with at the moment. I think that's a good selection of performance for now, and there's definitely room for some of these monitors to upgrade their performance depending on whether they can have some of their issues fixed. I think DWF is a strong candidate for increasing into the S tier if they fix that product. I think in terms of its HDR, I think PG4WQ could upgrade to the A tier if it was cheaper. GP27U, if they minimize the flickering issues again, could move up. Inzone M9 could move up if it was cheaper. The GP27Q could move up several tiers if they manage to resolve that via a firmware update. And a lot of the D tier products could also shift up if they were a more affordable and cheaper option. So yeah, I think that's pretty much where things stand for now. I think I've been recording for about an hour, so again, this will be a long video for people. But yeah, I guess that'll pretty much do it for this year's tier list for 2022. All the monitors that we've reviewed ranked, all 26 of them. I'm hoping to test more monitors in 2023, than I did this year. Last year I reviewed 31, we're down to 26 this year, but I've got plenty of monitors to test in the early parts of next year. I'm expecting lots of new great HDR monitors as well coming, so subscribe to Monitors Unboxed for more monitor reviews. As I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in any of the full reviews of these products that we tested, the exception being the M27Q, which we never reviewed, you can see all those on the Hardware Unboxed or Monitors Unboxed channel, so you'll find reviews for that there. Also, if you're interested in seeing the pricing for your region for any of the products we've been talking about, links to those are in the description below. And also, if you want to support the channel, then we have our Patreon float plan accounts, also links in the description. So yeah, thanks for watching this tier list video. Hopefully you enjoyed it and seeing how our rankings ended up in the end, and I'll catch you in the next one.